You think you make logical decisions with your money. The data suggests otherwise. Let's run the numbers. The same financial choice can feel different when it is immediate rather than distant. Plans made for later may change as the decision moves closer. That tension opens a puzzle about structure rather than personal failure. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Timing can alter which consequence receives the most attention. The answer begins by examining the route around the choice, not only the outcome. This requires a careful comparison. A future intention may be sincere even when present action later diverges. This makes the surrounding sequence part of the decision itself. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. Now, the mystery is why unchanged options can produce different choices across time. The contrast matters because preference and completion are not identical. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Temporal framing can reshape a decision before any circumstance changes. We can investigate the pattern while allowing responses to differ across contexts. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. Distant costs may seem manageable until they become immediate. The result can look like weak discipline even when the pathway carries much of the burden. Individual circumstances can change the result. Immediate rewards can become more vivid as the choice approaches. This creates a practical gap between wanting an outcome and reaching it. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Commitments made early may weaken when short-term pressure arrives. That distinction prevents us from treating every incomplete action as a revealed preference. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Delaying a decision can preserve flexibility but also invite reversal. Inspect the choice architecture. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. The distinction remains important. A deadline can sharpen attention while narrowing the comparison window. Seen this way, the obstacle belongs partly to the environment. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Timing can create disagreement between present preference and earlier intention. The practical stakes appear when the same intention repeatedly meets the same barrier. The surrounding context still matters. Temporal framing concerns how the moment of choice changes evaluation. Used carefully, the concept explains a pathway rather than declaring a fixed trait. Individual circumstances can change the result. Time preference describes how value may shift across different delays. This framing preserves room for rational choice, changing circumstances, and individual variation. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Present bias gives disproportionate weight to what is available now. The mechanism becomes clearer when the surrounding conditions are named explicitly. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Hyperbolic discounting is one model for nonlinear changes in delayed value. A precise definition prevents the label from becoming an overbroad explanation. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. Preference reversal occurs when the ranking of options changes as time passes. This definition keeps the analysis separate from moral judgment or guaranteed prediction. The boundary should remain explicit. A reversal does not automatically mean the earlier or later choice is irrational. The distinction matters because adjacent mechanisms can produce similar visible outcomes. The surrounding context still matters. Immediate context can reveal information that was absent in advance. It also allows a bounded explanation without claiming that everyone responds identically. Individual circumstances can change the result. Stable preferences and timing effects can coexist in the same person. That boundary helps separate structural influence from personal preference. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Distance allows abstract goals to dominate because concrete costs remain faint. The immediate experience may therefore outweigh a distant or less visible consideration. This requires a careful comparison. Proximity makes effort, discomfort, and opportunity cost more vivid. Once repeated, the sequence can become easier to follow than to reconsider. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundary should remain explicit. Anticipated future restraint may rely on a version of the self facing weaker pressure. The practical consequence depends on timing, clarity, and the cost of reversing course. The boundary should remain explicit. Repeated postponement can become a sequence of locally reasonable decisions. This is one mechanism, not a complete explanation for every financial decision. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. Interestingly, an option framed for next next month may feel easier than the same option framed for today. The effect may strengthen when motivation is moderate and competing demands are present. Temporal landmarks can create a sense of fresh commitment without changing incentives. A different environment could redirect the same intention through another sequence. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Deadlines can motivate completion but may also encourage rush simplification. The relationship is conditional, which is why context must remain visible. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Advanced choices can protect long-term plans from immediate temptation. The pathway matters because each stage can either preserve or drain momentum. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundaries should remain explicit. Flexible timing can be valuable when circumstances genuinely change. This helps explain why small design features can have cumulative consequences. The boundaries should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Rigid commitment can become harmful when new information deserves reconsideration. Defaults influence, they do not determine. The boundaries should remain explicit. Individual circumstances can change the result. The distinction remains important. Timing interacts with salience because nearer outcomes occupy more mental space. This step changes what receives attention before the final comparison is made. Individual circumstances can change the result. Timing also interacts with friction when action becomes harder at the critical moment. The next effect emerges because limited attention must be allocated somewhere. The distinction remains important. A delayed benefit may need a concrete intermediate step to remain behaviorally relevant. That shift can alter completion while leaving the available options formally unchanged. This requires a careful comparison. Immediate costs may be easier to accept when separated into smaller decisions. The mechanism builds through several small demands rather than one dramatic event. The outcome is not predetermined. Preference reversal often emerges from changing weights rather than changing values. This creates a pathway from environment to action without implying inevitability. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Some reversals reflect learning, not bias. A rational explanation may fit better when real costs or new information are present. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. Uncertainty about future income or obligations can justify waiting. This limit prevents the concept from becoming an excuse to ignore genuine preferences. Individual circumstances can change the result. Commitment devices may protect intentions but can reduce useful flexibility. An intervention can help one person while making the process harder for another. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Early decisions can reflect unrealistic confidence about future discipline. The design question must include autonomy, transparency, and who benefits. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Late decisions can reflect temporary pressure rather than settled preference. Removing burden is not automatically beneficial when reflection or protection is needed. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundaries should remain explicit. Different people may experience timing effects in different domains. These conditions mark the boundary between support and manipulation. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. The ethical boundary is whether timing tools preserve informed choice. The mechanism remains useful only when competing explanations are considered. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. The answer is that when a choice is posed, changes which consequences feel most immediate. The practical lesson follows from the root, not from blaming the chooser. Individual circumstances can change the result. Timing can influence behavior without proving that preferences are fake. This interpretation preserves both behavioral insight and rational exceptions. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. The distinction matters. A future plan becomes more durable when the next action is specified. The final answer is therefore about alignment between intention and design. This requires a careful comparison. Immediate temptation loses some force when alternatives are prepared in advance. This resolves the opening puzzle without claiming that the environment dictates every choice. The outcome is not predetermined. Deadlines work better when they clarify rather than merely pressure. The conclusion is structural but still leaves room for agency and changing priorities. The boundary should remain explicit. Commitment should be reversible when circumstances are likely to change. The decision can now be evaluated as a pathway rather than a single isolated moment. The surrounding context still matters. A useful design connects long-term goals with present concrete actions. That answer is stronger when stated conditionally instead of as a rule for every context. Individual circumstances can change the result. Timing should reduce avoidable conflict between intention and execution. The mechanism explains influence, not destiny. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. The opening paradox resolves when psychological distance is treated as part of the choice. The opening contrast becomes understandable once the hidden comparison point is exposed. This requires a careful comparison. Ask whether the decision should be made now, later, or in stages. The action remains bounded because different contexts may require different safeguards. The outcome is not predetermined. Separate information gathering time from commitment time. The aim is to make the pathway visible enough to evaluate deliberately. The boundary should remain explicit. The surrounding context still matters. Pre-select a future action while preserving a clear review point. That approach supports experimentation without promising a guaranteed financial result. The surrounding context still matters. Individual circumstances can change the result. Make delayed consequences visible through concrete present steps. Engineer the environment carefully. The outcome is not predetermined. Individual circumstances can change the result. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Use cooling off periods for choices vulnerable to short-term pressure. Small revisions can be tested before they become fixed routines. The distinction remains important. This requires a careful comparison. Avoid deadlines that force action before meaningful comparison. The test is whether the adjustment improves clarity while preserving meaningful choice. This requires a careful comparison. The outcome is not predetermined. Review whether a changed decision reflects new facts or temporary proximity. A useful change should reduce avoidable burden without hiding trade-offs. The outcome is not predetermined. The boundaries should remain explicit. Design the sequence so present and future priorities can both be represented. This turns the concept into a review process rather than a single prescription for every context. The boundaries should remain explicit. The goal is not perfect consistency, but better alignment across time. The useful lesson is to inspect the environment before judging the chooser. Don't fight your brain. Engineer your environment. See you next time.